Kia ora and welcome from Wellington and from around the country and indeed around the world today, where we have another great webinar for you. We hope that everyone's coping with the new lockdown here in New Zealand, and that this is providing a nice little break in your lockdown day. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Susie, Maxim and Patrick. They're members of our research portfolio on society, culture and policy, and they're going to talk about freshwater and biodiversity valuation. Questions are important to us. We love to hear what you're thinking as we go through the webinar. So I would just encourage you to put those questions into the chat box as early as you possibly can. So I'm ready to hand over to Susie. Patrick, have you got the slides up on screen yet?
So while we're waiting for this, I'm just going to say it feels like a bit of deja vu. Patrick and I actually did the first webinar, I think, during our very first lockdown about 1.5 years ago. And so this time we're talking about just as interesting as topics as last time, but it does feel kind of weird to be back here at home doing this again. So today I'm just going to give a very short rationale, and Patrick's going to do most of the talking about the work that he did around valuing water quality for us in New Zealand. And then Maxim's going to sort of finish off with just some a little bit of an overview of where the work has gone since then. But just as a bit of a heads up of what sort of where this work came from, and it grew out of repeated requests from regional councils, central government and other agencies and organisations about wanting to include more benefits and values into our economic analyses. And so we started looking around, and even though there were, a number of valuation studies that had been done in New Zealand, they weren't national in scope, which was a real issue for us, but also quite often they weren't particularly good for being used in a policy sort of context. And so Patrick and I sat down and we sort of started talking about, well, what would we need to actually create really good data for New Zealand to be able to use in a policy context and to be able to help decision makers make much better sort of decisions. And so this grew our non-market valuation work at Manaaki Whenua. So I'm going to hand over to Patrick now, and he's going to run through the work that we did around the water quality.
Sure, koutou. Thank you very much, Susie, and welcome everyone. As Susie noted, today I'm going to be talking about improving New Zealand's water quality and what it's worth, and this is a non-market valuation exercise around water quality. And so, as Susie noted, water quality in New Zealand is critically important, and it's also something that people see as needing a lot of work. So this figure is from the Public Perceptions of New Zealand's Environment Report, where rivers and lakes were voted as being in the worst condition of several environmental topics. This is further confirmed by other national reports on water quality and the state of the environment, as shown in this map, which shows the proportion of waters that are swimmable across the country. And now every year there are millions of dollars spent in this area, and so this newspaper headline highlights a 2019 budget that included $229 million for river cleanups, and so it just illustrates the type of money spent by central, regional, and local governments in restoring water quality. At the same time, another headline highlighted the difficulty in understanding and valuing water quality policy. This is clear as mud, states the headline. And that's because costs are typically straightforward to calculate. You can see the figure in the budget. You know the cost of mitigation structures or technology. But on the other hand, it's really difficult to monetize water quality changes to show the benefits on the other side of the ledger. So what is the value of clean water? It's a really tough concept, and there's several potential reasons for its difficulty to value. And as Susie mentioned, there's a somewhat thin New Zealand literature on water quality valuation. It can also be fairly difficult to link things that people value to policy levers that you might change through a government regulation or policy. And these are issues that are not only present in valuation of New Zealand, but also other issues like biodiversity that Maxim will talk about later. And there are also a few methodological issues with some of the existing valuation studies that we hope to improve on. This is a trend internationally as well. This table shows a table from Kaiser, Kling, and Shapiro in 2019 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it shows the benefit-cost ratio for water-related regulations out of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over the last 20 to 30 years. And you'll see in the highlighted column that the benefit-cost ratio from the median study is about 0.37, meaning that benefits are significantly less than costs in all of these regulations except for a handful. Now, Shapiro, Kling, and Kaiser also note that in many countries, expenditures to clean up rivers, lakes, and other surface waters have exceeded the cost of investment to clean up air pollution, and also have exceeded the cost of most other environmental initiatives. So are the benefits really less than the costs, or are the available methods just highly uncertain or very hard to estimate? So recent research and the continuing funding of these things suggests it's the latter, particularly given public support for water quality policy. And so to try to address some of these issues and improve water quality evaluation in New Zealand, Manaaki Whenua designed and implemented a stated preference choice experiment. And this is a method that economists use to obtain environmental values. In this survey, we used a nationally representative online survey that was designed using 2 rounds of 6 focus groups from around the country, as well as 10 cognitive interviews to really make sure that people understood what was happening in the survey and that the things we were talking about were relevant to them. And the survey we designed, as Susie mentioned, we wanted it to be particularly relevant for policy applications, because in a lot of cases, that's really the end goal of valuation, to try to get better water quality policy and be able to compare the benefits and costs in a more transparent fashion. And so in order to do these, we really focused on a few things. First, we wanted water quality variables that are both targeted by recent and future policy and relevant to people. And we wanted to present changes in water quality to people that are reasonable or realistic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But we target 3 main water quality endpoints. The first is clarity, and each of those we talk about on the survey. We targeted regional council level changes in water quality, because a lot of times that's where the policy gets implemented. The first is the average clarity level in the regional council, dealing with general recreation experience. Next is the percent of water bodies meeting their nutrient criteria. And so the focus of this was on habitat or ecosystem values. And then finally, we also had E. coli in there, dealing with the percent of water bodies meeting E. coli criteria. And these have to do with swimming and health. And so we're really curious about how people would trade off changes between these different types of water quality, and whether or not they would value all of these in the survey. And so in a choice experiment, respondents choose between different policies that have a cost associated with them. And on the right-hand side of the screen is an example of a set of policies that are used in our survey. So this is what, after going through a bunch of introductory text and several other questions, a basic explanation of each of these outcomes, this is what the people would be choosing from. And note how the first column is the no policy option. So that costs $0 and things just stay as they are. We don't put in a new policy. And so you're choosing between the no policy option and another column where, if you look at the bottom of the table, there is a cost to each household, every year. So in this case, either $6 per month or $3 per month. And those costs get you different changes in the water quality endpoints that we have on there, those 3 endpoints that we see a small explanation of each again. And now note how the largest change in water quality is that 8 percentage points in the lower right-hand corner, and we wanted to keep all of these consistently fairly small to the level at which you might actually see a successful policy do. If we compare this to some of the past studies in the literature, so if you look at Vascoran et al. In 2009 that came out, they were looking at nitrate leaching, and the different options they presented to people, one had a 50% reduction in nitrate leaching to streams. And I don't think there are any legitimate policies that would be able to do that. That would be a monumental achievement to get even a 20% reduction in nitrate leaching in a given regional council. That would be a monumental success story that would be talked about for ages. Here's another one from Vascoran et al. That looked at 10% reductions and 30% reductions. And again, this might, having changes that are this big in the surveys presented to people might reduce the credibility of the surveys. If you know about water quality policy, you might think that how are they going to do this and how is that going to happen for this small amount of money on the bottom? So in our survey, we wanted to make sure that we kept the changes within the relevant range of policies that you might actually see be instituted. And so we implement the choice experiment, give it to over 1,000 people, and then put it into an econometric analysis where we control for socio-demographic variables, regional council related variables, as well as user recreation types, like whether or not the person engages in contact or non-contact or passive uses. And in the end, we got about, after eliminating protest votes and other outliers, the econometric analyses use about 835 observations in the analysis. And so moving on to results, if we look at the marginal willingness to pay for a 1% increase in regional council water bodies meeting their nutrient criteria, we can see that this varied from about $5 and insignificant in Nelson to $40 in Canterbury. You can see they vary significantly across the different regional councils because we are able to econometrically control for a bunch of differences. We see quite a bit of variation across regional councils. Next, here's the values for E. coli criteria, so marginal willingness to pay for a 1% increase in regional council water bodies meeting their E. coli criteria. And those vary from about $23 in Northland to $40 in Wellington. And then finally, here are the marginal willingness to pay values for a 10 centimeter increase in the average regional council clarity. And these are significantly higher. People really placed a lot of emphasis on clarity values, varying from about $78 in Canterbury to $273 in Nelson for a 10 centimeter change. So those are the marginal willingness to pay values that we obtained. These positive and significant values were fairly robust across a bunch of different econometric specifications where we varied the variables and different interaction terms and different controls. And to show how these might be used, we used data from a project done by Whenua and Manaaki Whenua a few years back for the Ministry of the Environment that predicted changes in sediment and clarity. So Whenua did a bunch of modeling to show what would happen if you put some sediment control policies in place, what might happen to clarity and sediment. And this figure shows the outcomes of that modeling, which we can use our results to modify or to monetize. Now, if you look at these changes, a lot of them are fairly small, especially in Nelson, Marlborough, Bay of Plenty. Even Auckland only has a 7 centimeter average improvement across the regional council. And the biggest one being in Waikato with a 15 to 16 centimeter change. So if we apply our values to those, just the clarity values, we obtain an estimate of annual benefits for across the country about $18 million per year. So given that Auckland has the largest population, at a reasonable change, that had the highest annual benefits, compared to Waikato has a smaller population, so less households, but a fairly large change in water quality. They were about $4 million per year. And so now if you take these values and look across time, assuming the policy would be in place for a while, producing benefits, we can calculate the net present value of, say, 50 years of these changes. And if we look at two different discount rates, the benefits over 50 years of these changes are about $400 million to $500 million, depending on the discount rate. So this is the total net present value across all regional councils aggregated over 50 years. And so that seems like a large value, but to put it into perspective a bit, we can compare it to Auckland's recent water quality targeted rate. So in 2017, Auckland Council put up a vote for a targeted rate on water quality. And they calculated that for an average value home, they would pay about $66 per year. And the goal of that was to raise about $452 million for water quality improvements. And the vote passed with approximately 2/3 of voters in support of that. Went to a variety of different things as shown in the figure, but that just really illustrates that people are willing to pay a significant amount of money for improvements in water quality, especially very well targeted ones. And also stepping back, it's also worth noting that these benefits that we calculated only include the benefits of water clarity. If we would have had additional modeling that could have shown what happened to E. coli and nutrient outcomes, those would be additive to this, since we asked people about each of them moving independently in the survey. You could use all three of those. So this is actually an underestimate of the total potential benefits, given that the things you do to improve sediment also improve nutrient or E. coli. And so, just in conclusion, it can be really difficult to estimate the benefits of water quality policy. And so to really improve the literature and move things along, Manaaki Whenua conducted a national survey, and we found robust positive values for water quality that vary across regional councils and both user and regional council characteristics. And so in the paper about this, we go into some of the variation and how these values vary across people and regional councils a bit more. And the current plan is to redo the survey in about 1 to 2 years to explore the stability of values over time. So kind of repeat this exercise and see how that matches up, as national trends have changed and as time has passed, to try to see how robust they are. So that's mostly what I had to say about water quality, and now I'll turn it over to Maxim to talk about some work in progress.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So as you heard that there are issues, lack of data of valuing different environmental benefits, and another one is value of native vegetation or biodiversity. So we conducted a choice experiment of representative of all New Zealand regions about preferences for native vegetation. Specifically, we asked about changes in native vegetation, different types, and our attributes were restoring wetlands, restoring lowland forest, restoring hill country forest, and another one like protecting native vegetation through the covenants like QE2 covenant. So the goal was to have our attributes both relevant to respondents, people, and we asked about these changes in their own regions, and also make sure that these values are easily translatable to policies. Like if you're talking about area of increase or restoration or increase of specific ecosystem, that's, I guess, easy to put into valuation exercise or connect to policy. So we conducted this survey and now in the process of analyzing data, and this information will be useful to do prioritization, targeting, and planning of conservation and restoration programs. And we will let you know as soon as we have results. That's it.
Great, thank you very much, Maxim. That's it, and I'll open up the floor for questions. And Christine.
Thank you, and we've got some great questions. First of all, lots of thanks for a great presentation coming through from our audience as well. Here's a question that I think is for you, Patrick. Did the findings of the survey and how much people were willing to spend towards each outcome relate strongly to the current water quality in that region?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We include, as I was mentioning, different variables we control for that interact with water quality, and we include baseline water quality as an interaction term to control for the existing water quality in each regional council. And as you probably surmised, it was significant, but I think E. coli was the most dependent on baseline. So the higher the existing E. coli criteria, like the more water bodies you had meeting their criteria, the more people were willing to pay for that. That was the most sensitive to the baseline water quality. Whereas I don't believe nutrients were, which I was a little bit surprised about, but clarity was smaller and also significant.
Thank you. Now, what about a study to measure the likely impacts of doing nothing?
Yeah, I guess one thing that's been looked at in previous stated preference surveys like this is what if there's a negative baseline? So perhaps that's what the person's getting at, is that in this options we were presenting to people, we were saying no change in policy, but it may be the case that you have a negative baseline where if you don't do anything, water quality is actually going to get worse. That can really complicate the modeling and the econometric analysis. So we decided to not go with a negative baseline, but it is a relevant question, especially if you're projecting fairly far out into the future. We're assuming that the baseline stays relatively similar, but if it's really nosediving, then you might get different values. So yeah, it's a relevant point.
Further work. Can you tell us anything about who values the water quality most highly? I.e., did you look at the demographics of your sample?
Yeah, so one of the things that came through strong was education, especially with Clarity. Our education and Clarity interaction was highly significant and positive. And then the other thing we were a little bit surprised about when it came to individual level controls was the user variables. People who fished, like active recreational fishers, had lower willingness to pay for nutrient changes, all else constant, than other people. And so Susie and I and Maxim were talking about this for a while, and that might be because, if you look in the literature and even do some Googling, there are a lot of people that just think increases in nutrients mean more fish, because you put more nutrients in the water, that's more food for the fish and you get more fish stocks. So there are some fishermen and women that might be under that impression, and so perhaps that's where it's coming. But that was one of the surprises that came out of the survey. And it's not a large amount that they're willing to pay less, but they, all else constant, when it came to nutrients, fishermen and women who are active in that were willing to pay a little bit less than others.
Right, now I'm just going to ask you to dig back into one of the slides that you had. Takatsuka et al. on the slide, I think that was a table that you included a willingness to pay for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Could we apply a similar methodology to undertake this analysis?
Yeah, so this was both an interesting and problematic part about that Takatsuka study, is that you're asking people a whole lot to try to value both water quality, soil quality, views, and greenhouse gas changes all in one study. I might argue against doing that because how many policies are going to get very large changes in all of those? But I think people have definitely used similar choice experiments to value air quality changes. There's been a lot of work done in economics and social sciences on valuing greenhouse gas emissions. So we've done work previously for both MFE and MPI where we've tried to value changes in air quality as a result of carbon sequestration and carbon emissions from forest changes. And so, yeah, there's actually a really robust literature on that. And the kind of backstop value that you might use for a quick back of the envelope calculation is the price in the New Zealand ETS market, which hovers between $20 and $30 per ton any given day. But most people would argue that that's a lower bound because farming is not included in there, as well as several other market problems there.
Right, more work to be done. We just wanted to touch also on the Auckland example. So I think your information showed that households compulsorily paid $66. Do you have any thoughts about the amount of water quality benefit that payment might actually get you?
Well, yeah, that's hard to detect. So I was trying to dig into this actually to try to see, if we could connect some modeling outcomes to this to really ballpark the, household willingness to pay a bit more for what they get from it. But it's really hard just looking at this pie graph for how many things were being done. There was a lot of stormwater management, a lot of hard infrastructure going in. And so there really were heaps of things that they were doing to go in there. And so it's pretty difficult to then connect that to, several years later down the line as to what you would project to get as an improvement in water quality. I was hoping that there'd be some modeling on that. I wasn't able to dig any up, but in this $66 per year, this is that's an estimate for the average house. It was a tax that was put on both households and businesses. So higher valued houses and higher valued businesses will be paying more every year for that. But yeah, it would be ideal to connect to that to some actual modeling and the water quality change, but unfortunately the data weren't out there.
Great. Back to the regional differences. The regions with poor water quality seem to value improvements most. So how do you value the protection of those areas that already have high water quality, where people don't perceive the value or the need to make the improvement?
And so trying to get to equity concerns, and that if people already live in low water quality, they're kind of used to it and they're not as willing to pay for more water quality. Perhaps that's what it's getting at. I was surprised to see how much these varied across councils, across the 3 different indicators. So if you'll notice, nutrients, Nelson was one of our lowest here, but that's the highest for clarity. So it really does show that these values differ quite a bit across regional councils. And then if I could go, here are some graphs that were presented to respondents that show the baseline water quality levels. So if you compare that to nutrients, here, these are just for the North Island, for example. You can see that these really vary significantly across areas. But I think that would be some interesting future research, is to see if there are equity concerns there, for places that have much lower water quality. Are they willing to pay a lot less? I think that's a really good question for a lot of good research.
Great. And I've just got time for one more curly, interesting question here. Sorry, I am choosing the difficult ones today. You argued that only small changes in nitrogen losses are practically realistic, but you could argue that an 8% reduction isn't likely to generate much visible change in outcomes, and that land use change might be needed to get bigger reductions. Did the survey respondents actually know what those reductions mean in terms of outcomes? And what did you tell them about that?
Yeah, so for each one of these outcomes, we had, a page of, this figure and then a bunch of explanatory text. And that was one of the things that we really chopped through the focus groups and the cognitive interviews quite a bit to really try to make sure that people understood them. We settled on some decent text that we pulled from the literature and some of the other experts in Manaaki Whenua on, nutrient reductions and nutrient criteria. We put it through a number of people. We hope that we conveyed that well to people, but there's certainly always room for improvement. And you do really touch on one of the difficulties in valuing water quality, is because nutrient leaching is one of those things where you're controlling what's going in, but then when it comes to what happens down the line, to things that people actually care about, you reduce nutrients and then it does things to the water and it does things to fish and all types of other aquatic habitat, and then people are able to notice more fish or better swimming. That's really highlights some of the difficulty in valuing water quality, is because there's this complex chain between the policy lever and the thing that people care about. So I think the point is well noted.
And there are indeed a number of questions around this kind of topic. And what we're going to do from here is gather those questions together. We will come back directly to those of you who have asked those questions with some considered responses from Patrick, Susie and Maxim. So thank you very much for bringing those questions in. A number of you have asked about publications, and we will ensure that we share information about publications available and where you can access this work.
I'm happy to share a draft with whoever needs it. So please let Christine or myself know, and we hope to get it submitted for publication within the next month or two.
So yes, there'll be more on this topic, and there'll be related topics coming through in our webinar series. So watch your emails for further email and for further invitations. So I'd like to say thank you, and we'll sign off for now and look forward to being in touch next time around. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.